The gospel text this morning comes from Mark chapter 7. From there he set out and went away to the region of Tyre. He entered a house and did not want anyone to know he was there. Yet he could not escape notice. But a woman whose little daughter had an unclean spirit immediately heard about him, and she came and bowed down at his feet. Now the woman was a Gentile, of Syrophoenician origin, and she begged him to cast the demon out of her daughter. But he said to her, "Let the children be fed first, for it is not fair to take the children's food and throw it to the dogs." But she answered him, "Sir, even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs." And then he said to her, "For saying that, you may go. The demon has left your daughter." So she went home, found the child lying on the bed, and the demon gone. The word of the Lord. Over the last few years, I've been given the chance to work on my writing. I've come to love writing fiction and short stories and novels and particularly things set in the past. I think the past, as a history major, obviously has a way to inform and incite and excite us. And so, as a writer, I'm constantly reminded of the ability of stories to provoke questions, to probe uncomfortable thoughts, and to make us rethink what we think we know. Throughout the Bible, narrative is key. Jesus used parables. The various Christian creeds reaffirm the stories passed down, and the entirety of the scriptures can be seen as a prolonged story of redemption and reconciliation. In light of that, I offer the following story as my sermon. Dogs. It's hard to think while your daughter writhes on her pallet, the bedsheet snaking about her legs. Dinner is forgotten when sweat pours down your little one's cheeks like a cracked wine jar. When her screams rend the night like a dog's howl, it's difficult to fall back asleep. Asleep. My daughter Leda never sleeps anymore. The spirit-possessed dreams that plague her constantly cannot be called rest. This morning's bout happened when I needed bread for the morning meal. As I turned the dough, the soft mound flexing in my fingers into a thin cake, it started. A few years ago, I might have dropped the small pitcher of olive oil, shattering it upon the ground, but now, Leda's screams are simply part of the routine. Telemon burst through the door, I crossed to him, touching his shoulder. "My husband," I said. Without looking at me, he cocked his ear towards the bedchamber. "She's at it again." I nodded, not looking at the granite lines in his face, the eyes that hardened and narrowed. He nodded towards me, the unspoken order clear, and he bustled from the house. I replaced the pitcher of oil next to the unfinished bread and entered the room. As usual, her eyes were open. They stared back at my questioning glance, but she saw nothing. Perhaps she didn't even exist in those moments. From the vapid glance and the gaze, one would never know. I placed my hand on her arm. The touch sent her into spasms. She screamed, straining her arms about to strike me. My hands knew their business, though, and blocked the hit with ease. I gripped her arms, pinning them back to her sides. "It's all right, little one," I said. "It's okay. You're all right." As she struggled against my hold, I leaned in to kiss her forehead. The sweat on her brow touched against my lips. The salt, like the tears I'd long since given up crying. As a hen clutches her brood, I held her, my only child. When the screaming stopped and she lay there spent, I returned to the unfinished meal. Life as we know it in the house of Telemon. I rarely sacrifice anymore. To be honest, I gave up believing in its worth long ago. Father Zeus, Apollo, the gods have all heard my plea. When we offer to any god anymore, it is at Telemon's behest, and he simply does it to keep up status. Heaven knows why. It's not as if we have any left standing entire anymore. As the months went by, as Leda's demons continued to rack her body, we lost all friends. Who can associate with us? Who can suffer to be acquainted with ones the gods have forsaken and forgotten? I don't blame them, Telemon's old friends, that is. Had their children been afflicted with this curse, I would be the first to suggest he flee from their company. My husband's brothers visit, of course, but at the first sign of Leda's screams, they find themselves suddenly needed elsewhere. Bereft of company, the gods are the only place we have left to turn. And today, as I trace the streets, I ignore the glances. They know me, the people who stare. They know the family whose daughter is an animal, a wild hound that growls and moans and writhes and aches. They know me, these people, but I have given up pride long ago. This week, it's to be Hephaestus again, the crippled god, the unhealed god. Back again, said the priest in the columned entryway, cleaning his knife from the blood of a lamb that no longer bleats. The smell of charred meat and incense, the sound of the lyres fill the room. Chisel marks rake the columns of the rough-hewn temple. I don't look at him, my eyes tracing the dust on the floor. On days like today, when the rains have been missing for weeks, you can even see footprints in the grit. This print right here, even has a mar in the leather. The wearer needs to see a cobbler before I said, "You've returned," he said, stepping closer. I brushed the fallen hair back from my face and glanced up, but not to his eyes. "Yes, sir." I held up my coins, the copper dulled by age. I am here to sacrifice." He replaced the knife at his belt and snatched the coins from my palm, the clink of the metal obvious in the open space. He barely glanced at them before walking away. "I'll see to it." A few steps later, he turned back. "You know this isn't enough to buy an animal." I kept the bitterness from enveloping my face. Did he think me a fool? Even a sheep for the kill costs more than we can spare. Leda's healers. My eyes now snapped up, and I did look at him. I nodded, the slightest movement of my chin. "I know." He laughed quietly. "One would think you'd spend your money better then. The gods rarely listen to the sound of copper coins." Without another word, he disappeared into the temple, leaving me to stare through the gloom of the smoke of the altars. "The Nazarenes in town," said Telemon. I asked around a bite of peppery stew. Leda, in one of her better hours, was with us at the table. Her spoon dipped into the soup, ladling the broth through her mouth. "Father," she said. We froze. This will be her only speech for the day. "Who's the Nazarene?" she asked. Telemon smiled, warmth creeping, if only for a moment, back into his face. "He is a man called Jesus, from Nazareth. He performs miracles." "Like a prophet?" "Yes, little one," I said, patting her arm. "He's performed signs like the gods' messengers, and they say he may be even able to raise people from the dead." "Oh," she said, returning to her soup. I sent our daughter to play outside after the meal. Looking to my husband, I said, "And what does this mean for us?" He turned his head. "What does what mean?" "Jesus." He shrugged. "Nothing more than a curiosity." "And for Leda?" I asked, clearing the bowls from the table. At that, he wheeled on me. "Don't even start." "What?" "She's not getting better." I glanced toward the door. He saw. "I don't care if she hears me. Her mind is not half what it should be, and the curse will never leave her." My breath grew hot. "Then why do we hope?" "We don't," he said, tilting his chin up. "We live in this hellhole of dishonor and shame. There is no hope anymore. The gods have abandoned us to the dogs. Outside, Leda began screaming. He won't see you. He must, I said. My hand shot to the pouch at my side. I dug through it feverishly and thrust the coins to him. I leaned to look around him. The others were lounging inside, and the flagon of wine was just being passed around. I thought I could even see the Nazarene at the table. Please, sir, he must. Take these, I have heard. The man held up a hand, stepping further to block the door. It doesn't matter what you've heard. And woman, we don't want your coins. The master is tired from travel. All he wants now is quiet. Peter, a voice called from inside. The man, Peter, turned, stepping backwards at his name. Without thinking, I steeled myself and shoved past him. His cry of surprise filled the room for a moment, and then everything was silent. They pierced me with their eyes. I did not wither. Who is this? One asked. A woman. My coins still in my hands, I moved towards him. There was only one in the room who could be him. Jesus, the one some of the Jews called the Christ. His robe was white, if dusty, the sandals on his feet tarnished from travel but sturdy. Indeed, his clothes were much like the rest. But it was his eyes. I found myself unable to keep my gaze downwards. From the moment I stepped into the space, I found my look impossible to tear away. I cannot remember the color. I rarely can with eyes. But his eyes were so old that I glanced to his beard. Satisfied, he was young. I returned to his eyes and studied them as a potter studies his clay. Knowing my course, I walked forward, the others still staring, their eyes hot or amused. Woman, what do you want? Jesus said. Unbidden, my brow raised. Didn't these prophets know instinctually what was needed? If this man was a messenger of the gods, shouldn't he know? Some had said he even was a god. And his power, was he weak enough that he didn't know? He sipped from his cup, a drop of scarlet wine dripping down his beard. I couldn't help but be reminded of Leda, of the blood that trickles from the slashes she makes in her arms when we catch her too late. Knowing my course, I kneeled, my knees sinking onto the floor, my hair draping the earth. My daughter, I started. You are a Greek, he said. A Gentile. I nodded, the question surprising me. Before you ask, do you know that I am of Israel? Yes, Master, I said, repeating the apostle's title for him. My daughter suffers. She is plagued night and day by a terrible demon. She screams and hurts herself and can never sleep. I finished in a rush. He leaned back in his chair, the ancient eyes never leaving me. And a pain in my throat I hadn't noticed, now seared, and my fist tightened on the coins. Master, and they say you can heal people. He smiled for a moment, but only a moment. I can, but first we will let the children eat all they can before we throw their bread too. And here he nodded at me, to the dogs. Without waiting for an answer, he turned back to his wine, leaving me on the floor. With Telemon, hope had died in the second year. It was the first time that Leda had bitten him. With her teeth sunken into his flesh, his faith died. Not in temples, in the stares of friends lost, in the empty tears at night had I ever lost hope. I'd lost innocence, blind faith, I'd lost pride, but I'd never given up until this moment. When every single option is expired, is torn apart as the dogs fight over scraps in the road, where does one turn? Where does one go but into sleep or death? They'd resumed their conversation by then. as if I wasn't sprawled on the ground at his feet, as if I and my daughter hadn't just been called dogs. In my stupor, I thought I even heard some snickers. It took every ounce not to fling the money in his face and stalk from the room, every ounce to breathe, to think. "Master," I said at last, even the dogs eat the scraps that fall from the children's table. Even the dogs get that. He looked down, surprise in those old eyes, if not on his lips, which were pressed tightly into a thin line. The room froze again. At last he nodded, no light on his face. "You may go, Greek. Your daughter is well." For your reply, the demon is fled. I know not how I moved, how I escaped. I only gathered my coins, thought of offering them to him, but he'd returned to his wine, and so I rushed from the room, brushing the grit from the dirt on my dress. I made it perhaps 2 streets before collapsing against a wall. The rough plaster sliced into my shoulder, but I barely noticed. For your reply, the demon is fled. For what? For what reply? The priest of Hephaestus had said the gods rarely listen to the sound of copper. And to the sound of dogs? Are they more inclined to the braying of hounds? Is the God of the Israelites so inclined? Closing my eyes, I breathed in the stench and cacophony of my city. I listened to the merchants hawking their wares in the bazaar nearby, to the wagons clattering over rough dirt, and yes, even to the wild dogs that raced to and fro. If she were healed when I got home, if she were healed, what would that mean? What would it be to be indebted to the man who called us animals? Thinking not of this Jesus, but of Leda, I let my feet take me home through the crowded streets.